Good morning. You know, this passage this morning on the transfiguration of Christ is such a powerful passage, and yet so many times over the years I've had people, even as I had someone this morning say to me, a very difficult passage to understand. And I think maybe it helps if you understand what happened right before this event took place. There was a great moment in Caesarea Philippi before this took place. And this is where Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" And they identified it, they went on record as saying, "We believe that you are the Son of God, that you are the Messiah." And Jesus accepted that, their faith, their belief, and he gave them a forecast of what was ahead for him on his death on the cross. And of course, they were very dismayed. They didn't want to hear this at all. This wasn't the message they wanted to hear. And so this great moment of Caesarea Philippi was followed by the great hour on the Mount of Transfiguration. This mount was probably, the scholars think, Mount Hermon. It was somewhere on the slopes of this beautiful mountain. It wasn't real high on the mountain because it is a very high mountain. It's almost 10,000 feet high. But rather on the gentler slopes of the lower mountain. It must have happened at night as you read the passage. Luke tells us that the disciples were weighted down with sleep. It was the next day when Jesus and his disciples came back to the plain to find the father of the epileptic boy waiting for them. It was sometime in the sunset or the late evening or the night that this amazing vision took place. And I guess before we go any farther at all, we ask the question, why did Jesus go there? Why did he go there? Well, you've heard the theme this morning in the hymns and in our scripture and in our sharing this morning. Jesus went there to pray. He went there to pray. The main emphasis of his life was prayer. There wasn't anything more important in Jesus' life than prayer. Why was that? Why was prayer so important? Prayer was so crucial to him because the very theme of his life, his very heartbeat, was about God's will, right? He wanted God's will to be done, not his will. And he knew that the human part of him, at least, knew that the danger in him was to stray from God's will. And he didn't want that to happen. Why did he make this expedition to these lonely mountain slopes? And Luke, he gives us the clue again in Luke 9:29. He tells us that Jesus was praying. Now, I think it's a good idea to put ourselves, as far as we can, in Jesus' place here. See, by this time, he was on the way to the cross, and he knew it. He knew he was going to die on the cross. He knew that he was going to take the sins of the world upon himself on the cross. That he was going to carry our shame and the burden of our sin upon himself. He was sure of it. Again and again, he told his disciples that it was so. And so he knew that that was the ultimate plan for him. This was his Father's plan. Now he had to make sure then, sure beyond all doubt, that he was doing what God wished him to do, what God wanted him to do. Oh, if only you and I would seek after God's will with this kind of passion, right? He had to make certain that it was God's will that he should go to the cross. So he went up to Mount Hermon to ask God, am I doing your will in setting my face to go to Jerusalem? Jesus went up Mount Hermon to listen for the voice of God. He would take no step without consulting God. How then could he take the biggest step of all without seeking his Father's will, right? Of everything Jesus asked, one question, and only one question really. Is it God's will for me? Is it God's will for me? And that's the question that he was asking in the loneliness of the slopes of Mount Hermon. It is one of the supreme differences between Jesus and us, between Jesus and you and me. Jesus always asked, what does God want me to do? What is God's will? We nearly always ask, what do I really want? Right? What do I really want? We often say that the unique characteristic of Jesus was that he was sinless. What do we mean by that? Well, I think we mean precisely this. Jesus had no will but the will of God. He sought the will of God with everything he had. I came across an old hymn this last couple of weeks as I've been working on this message, and I thought, boy, this expresses it so powerfully. The hymn says, "Thy way, not mine, O Lord, however dark it be, lead me by thine own hand. Choose out the path for me. I dare not choose my lot. I would not, if I might. Choose thou for me, my God, so shall I walk aright. Not mine the choice, in things of great or small. Be thou my guide, my strength, my wisdom, and my all." Oh, man, I want to live that kind of life. When Jesus had a problem, he didn't seek to solve it only by the power of his own thought, right? Only by his own will. He did not take it to others even for human advice. He took it to the lonely place and to God, right? Not that we don't need as human beings, of course, we know that. We hear God's voice through people. And that's one of the amazing things about meetings that some of us attend and Bible studies and groups that we're involved in, right? Man, I hear God's voice. I have never been to a meeting, and I've been to a lot of them. I've never been to one where I didn't hear God's voice. And often it's speaking. He's speaking through a very simple person and through a very simple truth, right? But this is what Jesus did. He went to a lonely place to be alone with the Father. Wow. There on the mountain slopes, he had a couple of visitors. This is pretty amazing. And of course, this is what stumps a lot of people. What's this about? What really happened here? It says that Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Now, we know from the Old Testament scriptures, this is the Shekinah glory of God. God was here. God was in this place. This made it a holy place and a holy moment. His clothes became as white as light. And suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. I think if you keep three things in mind here with Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, three things. Moses represents the law, right? He always represents the law. He brings to us the law. Elijah brings to us the message of the prophets. And so we have the law, the prophets. What does Jesus bring? He brings the fulfillment of the law and of the prophecy. He brings the fulfillment in the love of God. See, they'd blown it so bad. The religious leaders had blown it so bad. And they got so caught up in the law. And they got so caught up in the jot and the tittle. Caught up in keeping every little rule and regulation. And practicing the rites and the rituals, right? That they lost sight of the message. And so the prophets, they came. And they came to try to get people to reconnect with the Spirit and with God. But you know, sometimes it's obvious they were really ticked off. They didn't have, a lot of love doesn't come through some of the messages, right? And so what happens? Jesus comes. He comes to fulfill the law and the prophets in the fullness of the very heart of God that had been missed for so long, right? He came to embrace the law and the prophets. When Moses came down from the mountain of Sinai, he did not know that the skin of his face shone. Both Moses and Elijah had their most intimate experiences of God on a mountaintop. It was into Mount Sinai that Moses went to receive the tables of the law. It was on Mount Horeb that Elijah found God, not in the wind and not in the earthquake, but in the still, small voice. Wow. Now I think in this episode of the transfiguration, there are some things that jump out at us really here in the scripture. First of all, the minds of the disciples must have been still hurt and bewildered by the insistence of Jesus at Caesarea Philippi that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer and die. It must have looked to them as if there was nothing but black shame ahead. But start to finish, the whole atmosphere of the mountain of transfiguration, what is it? It's glory. It's the glory of God. It's not this black shame that they were feeling when they went with Jesus from Caesarea to the mountain. No, now it was different. They were being transformed by the Shekinah glory of God's presence, right? Even as Jesus was transfigured before them. And they realized he really is God. He really is the Messiah. Just like he said. This is a bigger picture than we thought, right? This is a bigger picture. Wow. The Jews, they well knew the promise of God to the victorious righteous. Their face shall shine as the sun, we read. No Jew could have ever seen that luminous cloud without thinking of the Shekinah, the glory of God resting upon his people. There's one very revealing little touch in this passage. No fewer than 3 times in its 8 brief verses, there occurs the little interjection, behold, look you, look. It is as if Matthew could not even tell the story without a catch of his breath, right? At the sheer staggering wonder of it. The Shekinah glory of God. Just to catch a glimpse of it. Just to read about it. Just to read about it. should stir our hearts and fill us with wonder and awe. Wow, these disciples, wow, what an experience. And so much so, well, first of all, before I move to the next section of the scripture, I think there's something else here that we need to focus on, and that is that Peter must have learned, I think, 2 lessons that night. When Peter woke to what was going on, his first reaction was to do something, to build something, right? To build 3 tabernacles, to build 3 tents or 3 booths, you know. I don't know why I've had this image in my mind, but all week long as I've been working through this scripture and thinking about this and reflecting on it and praying over it, I keep getting an image in my mind of Peter building 3 porta potties up on the mountain, you know, 1 for each of them, but maybe a little bigger, you know. But that's the image I've had in my mind. I don't know why. But I guess maybe if you're up on a mountain, you do want a place to... Anyway. So I think Peter learned 2 lessons that night. First of all, he woke up then, and he wanted to be really busy. He wanted to build these 3 tabernacles, he called it. 1 for Jesus, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. You know, Peter was always a man of action, right? He was always the man for action. Always the man who must be doing something. But I think he learned here maybe there's a time for stillness, right? There's a time just to be quiet and to wait. As the man, it says, Peter blurted out. I love that. Peter blurted out, impetuous Peter. I love that. Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here, right? I mean, he was caught up in it, and I don't blame him at all. He was caught up in the glory and the Shekinah glory of God. I'll make 3 shelters as memorials. 1 for you, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. But even as he spoke, right, he was still speaking, a bright cloud came over them, and a voice from the cloud. And of course, when there's a cloud, to the Jew, that cloud was always the symbol of God's presence. Always. And so they were so moved by God's presence there with them. A voice from the cloud said, if the cloud itself wasn't enough, a voice from the cloud said, this is my dearly beloved, my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him. Listen to him. Now, this stopped them in their tracks. I think Peter stopped his plans for building those porta potties. It says the disciples were terrified and they fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and he touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. And when they looked, they saw Jesus only. Moses was gone, Elijah was gone. That glow was gone now. Everything was just the way it is now, sort of normal, right? Peter didn't want that. He was a man of action. He didn't respond well to that idea that, because he was awed by reverence in the presence of the supreme glory of God. He wasn't excited about stillness or a contemplation or even the wonder and adoration. It needed to lead to action. It needed to lead to action. It may be that sometimes we're too busy trying to do something that we would be better just to be silent, to be listening, to be wondering, to be adoring. in the presence of God. Before someone can fight and adventure upon his feet, he must wonder and pray upon his knees. See, Peter and James and John were going with Jesus back down the mountain. Jesus knew they were going back down the mountain. And he knew that they needed to be prepared for what was coming, right? Because they barely got down the mountain. They were still just on the edge of the mountain when they were approached to do ministry and to do healing, right? And so I think it's clear that Peter, he thought they could live up on the mountain. You know, Moses and Elijah and Jesus, they'd have little huts. And the rest of us, we can just bask in their glory. Let's stay on the mountain. Have you ever been there where you'd like to stay on the mountain? You don't really want to go down? I'm sort of going through that right now in my life, you know, with this whole retirement thing, right? I guess I feel like I've been so blessed. Well, that's what I do feel. I feel like I've been so blessed here at Central to be a part of the miracle here and the ministry of transformation here. Letting go of that is sort of like going back down the mountain, right? You have to let go of the presence of God in this way, and you go down the mountain, and guess what? God's with you. God hasn't left you, and you haven't left God. But we've discovered something, and that is, you can't live on the mountain. And God didn't call us to live on the mountain. God called us to live in the world, right? To minister in the world. And my old friend from years ago, John Wimber, down in California, he always said it. The meat is in the street. That's really where we belong, is out in the world. Coming here to worship and the joy that we share, the mountaintop that we share here, is to prepare us to go out there, right? We're to go out there. That's where we go. That's where we minister, right? Wow. So I think it's a feeling probably familiar to all of us, not just to Peter, that's for sure. He wished that great moment to be prolonged. He did not want to go down to the everyday and common things again, but to remain forever in the sheen of glory, the Shekinah glory that Christ experienced there on the mountaintop and that they experienced with Moses and Elijah. And I think really, I missed this. I forgot to share this. I think the reason that Moses and Elijah came and why God led him up on that mountain was because of what he was going to face, because of his sincere desire to do the will of God. God sent Moses and Elijah to give Jesus words of encouragement, to let him know that it was going to be okay. That's why Moses and Elijah came. They were sent as messengers from the Father to stand there with him as God came in the cloud and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And Moses and Elijah were there to say, "It's going to be okay, Jesus. It's going to be okay. The Father will never abandon you. He's with you." Wow. So I think that even though it's a very natural feeling to not want to come down from the mountain, it's one that we all have experienced. There are always moments of intimacy, of serenity, of peace, of special nearness to God, which everyone has known and wished to hang on to prolong. The mountain of transfiguration is always more enjoyable than the daily ministry on the way of the cross, right? That's always more enjoyable, to be on the mountain. But the mountain of transfiguration is given to us only to provide strength for the daily ministry that we are called to enable us to walk the way of the cross. I love the teachings of the Wesleys. And the mother of John and Charles Wesley, Susanna Wesley, had a special prayer, and I wanted to share this with you in closing the message today. Susanna Wesley said, "Help me, Lord, to remember that religion is not to be confined to the church or closet, nor exercised only in prayer and meditation, but that everywhere I am in thy presence." Everywhere. And so, the moment of glory does not exist for its own sake. It exists to clothe the common things with a radiance they never had before. May we see Jesus only.